So we're going to start into chapter 2. And I recently listened to an episode of a podcast that's actually, I was introduced to it. It's a friend of mine. A lot of you probably know Ray Judy. His son Logan used to live in Columbus, lived in Lafayette. Now he lives in Knoxville. He co-hosts a podcast, and I listened to an episode that he did where it was titled, "Throw Away Your Concordance." And he was talking about the problem that people run into where they need to make an argument. I need the verse that says this. And they look up that word in a concordance and they find that verse and then they pluck that verse out and use it to make their argument. And he wasn't saying concordances have no value, but the point of the episode was it really benefits us when we can read the Bible not as a collection of flashcard snippets and each one is a separate thought, and each verse is a completely detached thought from the verse before and after it. He said, even better not to read it chapter by chapter. He said, really, if we could, it would benefit us to think of the Bible as a collection of books. That's really the only way the Bible was originally parceled out, was by book. So if you read entire book by book, you get maybe a different perspective of ideas than if you were to read it chapter by chapter or even verse by verse. It made me wonder, I'm sure there's probably Bibles you can find out there that do away with numbering and just write everything out in paragraph form. That would be kind of interesting to try. So I was going to do that for the intro of class. We're going to start in chapter 1, and because I think the first half of James chapter 2 covers a theme that really is started in James chapter 1, and I would say maybe about the last 5 verses or so of James chapter 1. So let's start in verse 22 of James 1, and I'm going to read into James chapter 2, and if you want to just listen and maybe not read along, you could try that, or if you do want to read along, try as best you can to just not look at the chapter division and just pretend like it's not there, and we'll see what this theme is as we develop class here this morning. James 1:22. But be sure that you live out the message and do not merely listen to it and so deceive yourselves. For if someone merely listens to the message and does not live it out, he is like someone who gazes at his own face in a mirror. For he gazes at himself and then goes out and immediately forgets what sort of person he was. But the one who peers into the perfect law of liberty and fixes his attention there and does not become a forgetful listener but one who lives it out, he will be blessed in what he does. If someone thinks he is religious, yet does not bridle his tongue, and so deceives his heart, his religion is futile. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their misfortune, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. My brothers and sisters, do not show prejudice if you possess faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. For if someone comes into your assembly wearing a gold ring and fine clothing, and a poor person enters in filthy clothes, do you pay attention to the one who is finely dressed and say, "You sit here in a good place," and to the poor person, "You stand over there," or "Sit on the floor"? If so, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my dear brothers and sisters. Did not God choose the poor in this world to be the rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom that he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Are not the rich oppressing you and dragging you into courts? Do they not blaspheme the good name of the one you belong to? But if you fulfill the royal law as expressed in this scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show prejudice, you are committing sin and convicted by the law as violators. I'll stop there. So I think, I was looking through James chapter 2, I think the first maybe 16 verses of James chapter 2, in my opinion, are all keeping the same theme and keeping the same thought. There are different things talked about and different specifics that get mentioned, but I think they can all be boiled down to one kind of key theme. Anyone want to try to read my mind and shoot out, what do you see as being the theme that James is carrying from, and I hesitate to even say from chapter 1 into chapter 2. In this part of James's letter, what is on James's mind primarily? If you were to make as broad of a category as you could that encompasses these verses, how would you try to do that?
Well, I could say what it's going to say later.
Mm-hmm.
Only because I think what he's trying to say, which we'll get to later, is that you You show your faith by your works.
Okay, that your faith is shown by your works. That is something that he's going to talk about more as he continues writing. I think there's even maybe even a broader category that might encompass that I'm thinking of. And no fault to anyone if you can't pick out the exact phrase that I'm looking for. Go ahead, Emily. Alicia, early morning.
What about a theme of the perfect law doesn't show favoritism?
Mm-hmm. The perfect law does not show favoritism. I think that's another good theme that's shown here, and it does carry the themes from chapter 1 into chapter 2. Chapter 1 ends with caring for other people and genuineness of one's faith, right? The genuineness of a person's religion. He starts out with how, it's not just something that's superficial, that you forget. It's not something that you put on as a label, but then it doesn't affect the things that you do. He also, so kind of this doer and not just a hearer type of person is someone who's not genuine in their faith. And then serving the needy and giving attention to those who have need is mentioned in the ends of James chapter 1. And that, I think, links to the beginning of James chapter 2, where, again, we have someone entering the assembly who has need and they are being mistreated or ignored. The umbrella I put down, the thing that I was thinking of was... Is it not just verse 8? Well, is it? If you fulfill the royal law, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I think it's a piece of it. I think he's just talking about... Go ahead, Margaret.
And I think another facet of it is the importance of keeping the whole law. That if you fail in one area, then there's not any little sin. It's a total area in keeping the entire law.
Right, yeah. And we'll get to that too. That mentality of it's not a game of scales and weights where, well, if I keep enough laws and if I do enough good, these few laws that I'm not so great on or these few sins that I have are outweighed by all the good I do. James dispels with that clearly. I think the overall umbrella is true religion, because I think James is addressing the issue of religiosity versus a true practice of faith. Remember, if James is writing to Jews, Judaism is an old religion by now, and it's been around for a long time. James is about as far removed from the old law as we are from the time of Christ. Actually, even a little less so. We're actually further away from the time of Christ than James would have been from Moses and the old law by a few hundred years or so. But Judaism is an old and established religion. It's been a religion, an organized religion, if you want to use that term, for a really long time. And what tends to happen with organized religion? It organizes more. I don't know if you're being facetious, but I think that's an accurate statement to make. It tends to coalesce and kind of, it thins down to a skeleton of acts and sacraments and customs and traditions, and organized religion can tend to become ritualistic and lose its original spiritual intent. You had something, Samantha?
Add something too, like basically, this is what happened with the Pharisees too. People start adding stuff that wasn't meant to be added.
Right.
Like you said, it winds up being tradition, or basically more organized.
Right.
And it doesn't look like what it used to look like, basically.
Yeah, I agree. The Pharisees were a reformationist or a revisionist sect of Jews. They thought, we got to get Judaism back to what it needs to be. And so they were layering all of their traditions onto the law to try to make Judaism look more like real Judaism. And the problem that Jesus pointed out with the Pharisees was what? That all of their traditions, the things that they put all their energy into, was about appearances. It was about the customs. It was about saying the prayers at the time of day you need to say them, and tithing the way you need to tithe, and going to temple when you need to go to temple, washing the way you need to wash. It was all of the mechanics of Judaism and none of the spirit of Judaism. So they say you will travel 100 miles to make one proselyte, and then you slam the door in the face of people who need God, who need the kingdom, because they were so interested in keeping those minutiae, those details. So let's get into the details now of James chapter 2. Beginning part of this chapter, opens with the idea of being a respecter of persons. And this being a respecter of persons, I think other translations use the word prejudiced. And I think that is a very good word to use to help us understand this idea. What is, if you were to break apart and describe being a respecter of persons or being prejudiced, what is it really?
Do you have more favorable treatment or even thoughts as well toward a certain type of person?
Okay. Joy?
A tool of exclusion.
A tool of exclusion. Okay, so Samantha and Joy gave us a few ideas. It's favor that we're showing toward a particular group of persons over another. And favor is one way that we can be prejudiced. Joy brings up another, which is exclusion. A withholding of favor from people is also another way that prejudice can be shown.
I'll take my own definition a little bit farther and say, like, you think that one group is better than another. I think that sounds a little bit more accurate.
Okay.
You basically think one group is better, and you show that by your treatment and what you say about them and your responses, things like that.
Okay. I think that's a fair dimension to add to it. Is prejudice very frequently, whether it's really intended or not, or whether it's really a focused, intentional thought or not, it's usually some sort of value that we're ascribing to certain people. And our brains are quite lazy, and we don't really like to do the mental effort of, I'm going to categorize every person I know as an individual and evaluate them on their individual traits. Instead, we say, well, this person is this category, and this category is good or this category is bad. Because they're in that category, I can quickly make an assessment about whether they're good or bad. Oh, so-and-so is Chinese. I have this opinion about Chinese people, and therefore it's easy to make an opinion about them because they're Chinese. That's how prejudice works in our brains as far as a mental shortcut that we tend to take. We do this with all kinds of things where categories make thinking a lot easier, and so we tend to make categories even where it's not justified to do so. I saw Jim had a hand and then Joy.
Yeah, I was thinking that partiality is bad. It has terrible consequences. You think about Isaac and Rebekah showed partiality, you see the result of that. And then time and again it comes up. And Jacob, he favored Joseph above the other brothers, and the end result of that was they was going to kill him. They sold him into slavery. So that's an example for us not to follow and take what James says. It'll help us to have that pure heart, and we'll help to shed the light to others. And a good way to shed the light that James is talking about, the mirror, is you be the candle and the mirror that reflects it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the point that Jim makes is a good one of the rift between people that partiality can cause, and the generational divide between groups of people that has resulted in real world conflict, wars, atrocities have been committed over this tendency to say these people are other than you, they are different than you, and they are in a group other than you, so it's okay to do this or that to them. It's okay to mistreat them as a group because they are different than you. And that's taking it to its extreme, but it's real history that's what happens when partiality continues and becomes accepted. Joy, then Samantha.
The dictionary is not God's word, but I need a dictionary. So I looked it up, and the synonyms of prejudice are non-objectivity, and believe it or not, it says poison.
Non-objectivity. That's a pretty good comparison as well. The Latin root for prejudice comes from the same words that we get judicial or judgment, and it's judging before, essentially, or making a prejudgment. So before you really have any information, or before you really know something, you already make up your mind that this is the way this person is. And so that's a good way. So that non-objectivity, you're being partial, you're being biased, that's a good way to consider it. Go ahead.
May I also add, sorry, the word that came to my mind was presumption.
Presumption, yeah. Another similar to, I don't know if that comes from assumption, presumption, they're related in that way. But yes, before you know something, you're making this idea, and treating someone based on the presumption. Your treatment of that person comes from the prejudice, not from the facts about getting to know them. Samantha, you had a point.
Yes. Also add that partiality can most likely cause someone to feel in ways about themselves that God doesn't feel about them, if that makes sense what I'm saying. They don't feel good about themselves at all because of how they've been, the partiality that they've been given.
Yes. Yes. Adding to the point Jim made about, the sons of Jacob were victims of partiality, and see how it affected their brotherly relationship when that partiality existed. They came to believe that, Joseph is this horrible dreamer, and he's making our lives miserable, and he's stealing all of Dad's favoritism, and he's going to get all the inheritance. Look at that coat. The partiality that Jacob showed to his sons resulted in them kind of internalizing the pain of being mistreated and categorized like that. And it caused strife. And you bring up another good point, Samantha, which the Bible tells us very clearly in no uncertain terms. There is no partiality with God. And that is key to understanding why James is making the point he makes here. It is so important that there's no partiality with God, because God is able to perfectly assess every single person's worth. And God knows every single person's worth, and He values every single soul. God does not put you in any group. If you're from a certain nation, if you speak a certain language, if you look a certain way, God does not put you in any category other than a category of one, and that's you, because He's able to perfectly and fully assess you as an individual. When He's seeking out the next king after Saul, God sees into the hearts. Man looks at the outward appearance. Samuel was looking for, all right, what categories am I looking for from a king? Well, he's got to be strong. He's got to be of some reputation. He's got to be maybe the oldest of his family. He's got to be from a worthy tribe. And God says, no, I'm looking at the individual. I'm looking at the person one by one and knowing who they are. I'm not showing any partiality here. So let's get into what are some of the ways and categories either mentioned here in James. There's kind of one example pulled out in James, but I think one of the questions Dad posed to us was, how can we start categorizing people and showing partiality? Let's do a little brainstorming here. What are the categories that we put people into? Go ahead, Ashley.
You said a couple of them that I have down, but cultural, language, different seasons of life,
Mm-hmm.
and opinions/judgments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, culture, language. I would say a subset of language, accent. Sometimes people get treated differently, even if they're speaking the same language as you, but if they just sound different. We went to a couple congregations in Eastern Tennessee, and there's a lot of different accents in different parts of this country. And if you walk into a church and go, oh, they sound like a bunch of country people, this isn't for me, you're categorizing based on the accent that you're hearing. In Southern Indiana, we don't really balk at a country accent, but in some places people do. And age is one that you brought up. You called it seasons of life. Age is a real way that people get lumped into categories. And, well, this person must hold this opinion because they're over the age of 60, and everybody who's over the age of 60 thinks this. That's certainly a way that we make presuppositions about other people. Was there another hand? Political affiliations, yep. That's one that is sort of a self-selected. You're not born into a political party. People tend to choose to associate into a political party, but it becomes a way that it becomes easy to categorize people who make the choice that's not the same choice you would have made. So that's one.
So maybe your abilities too could potentially be one.
Okay, yes, one's abilities. That's an area where prejudice can occur. Assuming that, well, because someone can't do certain things, they're less useful to the kingdom, they are less useful to me. That's ways that, and we'll talk a little more about this too. It could be consciously or unconsciously that we do this. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. What are some other categories?
Appearance is a big one.
Appearance, yes.
If you have tattoos or long hair or, scruffy beards, I mean, we are so ingrained to make a first impression
Yeah.
by appearance.
If I say someone's a hippie, what do they look like? You've already got a picture in your mind of what I just described. Well, is that accurate? Is that true? If I say someone's gay, what do they look like? You have a picture in your mind of what you think that looks like, when that is not a universal trait across a category. So we do that all the time with, well, they look a certain way, so they must be this way. And that's a very common problem with prejudice. Go ahead.
I know that's kind of one of the ones here, but socioeconomic, is certainly one of the ways that we tend to make prejudicial judgments. I mean, they're really rich, so they must be snooty and stuck up, and or they drive a certain type of car, so clearly they're this way or that way. They have this type of job, so they're, he's an engineer, so. I know, I picked on that on purpose, obviously. But anyway, I mean, people make assumptions based on what you do for work, or what you drive, or what kind of house you live in, or even what neighborhood you live in, or what part of town you live in. And it's like, those are not necessarily descriptive of who you are, they just are descriptive of what you do or where you live.
Right. And, you'll commonly hear people say, well, stereotypes become stereotypes for a reason. And these categories, they may not always be true for every person, but they kind of seem to be broadly true. They kind of seem to be generally true. I think that's just excuses. Whether that's true or not, it still does not become a metric that you can say, well, I know because it's generally true that it must be true in this case of this person. If 1% of a population is deviant from the norm of that category, you can't make the accurate assumption that, well, they must be the 99%. They must be like the rest of the category, 99%. Some other ones, race, skin tone, where someone originates from as a nation. These are areas that there's discrimination, that there's prejudice. Sex is one of them. The discrimination against women. If people hold the belief that they are less able than me, or that they are less of value than a person of my sex, that's another one too. Just prejudice based on family. This is common in churches where you have maybe generations of a family in a church, and I jokingly say dynasties in churches, where you've got these dynasties of families, and they either hold a lot of sway with the church, they might hold a lot of power in the congregation, because nobody wants to upset the so-and-sos because, well, they make up half the church, and we don't want them to get upset. Or they don't want to treat people outside of their family differently than they treat one another. They kind of just focus on their family, and everybody else in the church is external to their family. Grace?
Well, and I mean, you used to talk about sex and prejudice against women, and I don't mean this the way that a lot of people do on social media, but there are also prejudices against men. For example, when we're in a public place and I see a child doing something that I think might be dangerous, I usually will point it out to Ashley and say, can you help here? Because if I get involved, I might automatically be labeled as a pedophile, or you're trying to take my child away or whatever. And so I try to be careful about interacting with small children when their mothers are there in a public place, because I don't want to be labeled as something that I'm not. I'm just trying to help out. And so I'll say to Ashley, can you help here? And
Of course, in a situation where it's not your own child. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's my child. And like I said, I know people use that all the time. Well, what about White History Month and stupid stuff like that? And it's like, that's not my point. My point is just, people will look at men and make automatic assessments based on, well, why are you looking at my child? Why are you talking to my child? What are you doing? I mean, it's like, we just have to be careful that those kinds of judgments get made.
Right.
And use care when we're in places try to avoid uncomfortable situations, not just for me, but perhaps for a young mom.
Yeah. Anywhere where you think, I'm trying to think how I want to put this. Any situation in which you think there is a default setting that the world is, or that society needs to be. This is the norm, and everything that's not this is less than the norm or inferior to the norm. That's where you've got to be really careful that you're probably applying some form of prejudice here. You hear it sometimes when people say things like, well, this is a Christian nation, and so, our laws need to be laws that are of a Christian nation. That's from a viewpoint that, well, Christianity is just the norm. Christianity is not the norm in this nation, and sorry to burst your bubble, but America is not and was not a Christian nation at its founding. It was, if anything, kind of a rather agnostic nation toward religion at its founding, much opposed to the nations that it broke away from. And I saw a statistic recently. There was some surveying done of Americans, and it was something like 30, I think it was Americans who identified as church-going, or perhaps it was evangelical Americans. Something like 30% of them said that they supported the idea that the church should have veto power over any government action that the government takes. And I don't know where I'm going with this exactly, other than to say, believing that that is the norm and that anything else is different from the norm, it can lead someone to really be blind to seeing what other people's experiences are. That's really what I want us to get to. Were there other categories? Joy?
You said something about how we treat those dynasties in the church, and then also the opposites. For instance, years ago, their dad was a drug addict and an alcoholic, so blah, blah, blah.
Yes, I had written down categories of we'll be prejudiced against people based on knowledge of sin or past reputation, and that
Or
will...
holding the family accountable for something somebody else did.
Yeah, and so that shortcut that we take in our minds, well, it's easy to recall the category, it's easy to recall the past, and just treat the label as the reality. Labels don't always match reality, and so that's something we need to be careful of. What about the motives for this? I think this was one of the questions, too, that Dad gave us. The favoritism mentioned in James chapter 2 is somebody comes in who's wearing gold and fine clothing, and you say, sit in a good spot, sit in the good place right here, and then someone comes in filthy clothes, a poor person, and you say, go over there, sit on the floor. Why would they do that? Why be motivated to do this? What's the motive for this favoritism? Jesse.
It boils down to, we even have this today, is some groups, I won't say just congregations, I'll say entire groups, they want outward appearances. Oh, look how good we are, look how nice we look. We're so good in this. We don't want anybody to even shed a blemish on anything that we look like. It goes down to, yeah, the outside of the cup is polished and finely detailed, but the inside of the cup is filthy.
Yep.
Whereas somebody who comes in may be filthy on the outside, or not as dressed as nice as on the outside, may have a more pure heart.
Right. I mean, that mirrors so much the lessons that Jesus spoke when he was speaking to the Jews. When he was speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and talking about, you are focused on the image of religion, but you don't have a true spirituality. You don't have a true love for your brethren. You have a focus on religiosity and ritual. Why would we want an appearance of wealth? Why is that good? We make an association that wealth is good. The Jews often made an association that wealth meant you must be righteous because God has blessed you with that wealth. So the wealthier you are, the more righteous you must be. James points out a rather ironic contradiction here. He says, isn't it the rich who are making your lives more difficult? Isn't it the rich who are dragging you into court, and the wealthy are the ones who are making things hard on you? And he makes an appeal to, who did Jesus go to? Who did Jesus attract the attention of? It was the poor of that society. I would say probably none of his apostles were wealthy individuals. We talk about Matthew being a tax collector and how, that was an opportunity. He might have been skimming off the top and taking advantage of the government of Rome and building up his wealth that way. I don't know if that necessarily means Matthew was a particularly wealthy individual. He just had an association with money handling as a job. But all of these apostles were blue-collar guys, to use a phrase that we're familiar with. He didn't appeal to the wealthy. He didn't go straight to the most powerful and the richest of the day. He drew in those who were poor and in need. We'll get to that a little bit more in just a minute. One more maybe thing I wanted to cover on this favoritism is that there are different kinds of prejudice that we can fall into, and some of them may be conscious and some may be unconscious. This conscious kind of prejudice comes from, I think, James uses the phrase, you are judges of evil motives. So to say that you are being a judge, remember prejudging is prejudice, so you are prejudging with evil motive, I think there is perhaps contained the idea that they're aware that they're doing this and they want to do it for gain, whatever they see as being a reputational gain, a gain of how they're perceived. Maybe if we associate with the rich and if we treat the rich well, maybe they'll treat us well. Maybe we'll get a little kickback if we're nice to the rich guy who comes in. Maybe he'll drop a few extra coins in the coffers if we are nice to the rich attendees at church. Go ahead, Samantha.
You're talking about motives, and I
Mhm.
think some of that kind of came to my mind is one could be a fear, another could be you've had a bad experience, and so then that's when you start lumping people into a certain category because you've had a bad experience with one or maybe more of that certain category.
Right.
And that's unconscious. I don't think people do that on purpose.
Right, so that gets into the next one that I wanted to mention, which is unconscious bias or unconscious favoritism. And I think Samantha's right. Sometimes that might come from maybe a singular experience we had at one point. And so we're going to generalize, well, I once had a bad run-in with a Jew when I was in traffic. And so, Jews are bad drivers, and we take a generalization and draw it out to the whole group. That could be one. I think any kind of unconscious favoritism, unconscious bias, at its core, it really just comes from a lack of knowledge. It comes from ignorance. Mark Twain, I think, was the one who said the cure for racism is international travel. Mark Twain traveled the world, and he wrote about his travels to all these different places. And he said, you really learn to not hate people when you go all around the world and see all different people. And he was a humorist and a writer, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. The more that we expose ourselves to people who are different from us, the harder it is to be prejudiced against them when we've had positive one-on-one experiences with other people who are different than us. Joy, you had a hand.
So I was going to answer that one with verse 4, saying evil motives. But the way you read it, from whatever your translation was, made it sound like, okay, here's the way mine reads. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts, rather than what you said, which I think was that they have evil thoughts. Isn't that what you said? Judges that they have evil thoughts.
If I gave that impression, I wasn't intending to make that point. The version I read from is the NET, and it mirrors very closely what you read. If so, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives?
Okay.
So I would agree. The person who is making the prejudiced distinctions is the one who is judging with evil motives. I think another translation that I looked at, it might have been the American Standard Version, said ill-informed judges or unjust judges. So that ill-informed is speaking again toward what forms unconscious bias. It's from a place of not knowing. And we can do it without realizing we're doing it, and without even meaning to do anything bad to the other person, we can still do this. And I have an example of this that I asked Addie if I could talk about this, and she said I could. When I talk to people and they say, oh, where are you from? I say, Columbus, Indiana. And the conversation moves on. They go, okay, Columbus. And we keep talking. Many, many times when Addie talks to someone, they say, where are you from? She says, Crawfordsville, Indiana. And then they say, but where were you born? Or, and even worse, oh, where are you really from? And that's happened to her many, many times in her life. I have never gotten that question in my life. And the only reason I don't get that question is because people just accept that, well, I look like someone who could be from Columbus, Indiana. And people look at Addie and they think, well, there must be more to the story. And that's an unconscious bias that they make. So it doesn't, it's an ambiguous question either way. I could have been born somewhere else and say, I'm from Columbus, but no one ever asks that clarification. So whether people realize they do it or not, it draws out and it calls out distinctions between people without realizing that they're doing it. And it happens all the time. And I do it all the time. And the scary thing is, I do it without realizing I'm doing it. How can I correct something that I don't realize I'm doing? Well, open myself up to more experiences that I haven't had before. Open myself up to more people that I haven't interacted with before. And you will start to see and catch yourself doing things that you didn't even know you were doing. Samantha?
Well, and you kind of make a good point. You do it without realizing that you're doing it. And I think that's where people need to be patient and don't just jump to some bad conclusion that someone did that with a bad motive, or they were trying to be mean or trying to be mistreat somebody. That may not be the case at all.
Right.
So be careful about jumping to bad conclusions and just be patient with people because you don't know their experiences either. So.
Yeah. Harriet?
A lot of times when people make an unconscious decision to be swayed either way, a lot of times it's out of fear and pain, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. For example, you go into a congregation and you're treated terribly, no one talks to you, says hi or whatever, and you leave and you're like, well, I'm never going to church again. The pain and fear, and that keeps people out of the hospital too. Physical pain,
Yes.
fear, that type of thing. So I think, and I know from my experiences in the hospital, people come around the corner and see me, hi, how are you? You want a drink? I'll give you medicine to feel better. I mean, people are in pain. Are you going to judge me? No. No, you're here for help. This is why I'm here. I'm here to help you.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things as Christians, setting a good example, that's my philosophy, and going above and beyond. So you're prejudiced against me because I'm a nurse. I'm going to show you that I can go above and beyond and get you the drink of water in the middle of the night, get you what you need, and find you some clothing if you need clothing, that type of thing. To show you I'm not in that slotted category. I hate being categorized. I've been called a hippie. That's okay, but I have an open mind. I'll talk to you. I have to talk to people all the time. And to be slotted, it makes me sad. It makes me sad, but I can rise above it and go the extra mile so I can prove you wrong.
Right. And you bring up a point that it can be happening from both sides of an interaction, and in completely different, there can be completely different categories that people on both sides of the interaction might be making. The person who is a churchgoer might have an impression of someone who comes into the church that, they're not the kind of person who would really fit in here. And that's just such a damaging thing to a church. That's such a damaging thing to the person who feels that interaction. But like you said, the person coming into the church might come in with a notion, well, the last church was bad, all churches are bad, let's see how bad this one is. And so there's unfair judgment going on the part of the recipient, but unfair judgment on the part of the one who's interacting with them as well. Was there another hand? Joy?
So, I think that Harriet made a very beautiful and godly comment. If she said, keeps people out of the hospital. So let's make that spiritual, and that kind of behavior can keep people out of God's hospital, which is exactly what they need, number one. And number two, she was able to say that she's able to rise above it, which I'm very glad. there are people who can't rise above it because of their past. So that's a strength on her part, but also that's especially beautiful to me. Keeps people out of the hospital.
Yeah.
God's hospital.
Yeah. If every person who comes into the hospital is a fresh case, no matter how much, someone comes into the ER, maybe they come in twice a week because they're ODing and they come in twice a week. Can they be treated as a fresh case every time, or do they just get treated as, oh, they're back, and then the level of care is worse, the level of care is not the same? Everyone who comes in, as often as they come in, deserves to be treated as a fresh, new case of a person in need. And that's true for healthcare, and that's true for church. Any other comments on prejudice? We've used pretty much all of our time this morning on this subject, but I think it's a good one that James covers. He's ringing the bell 2 minutes. Okay, not a minute early. the clock's a minute slow. Any other comments? Okay. Maybe one last one, and then maybe this will give Dad a place to pick up when we start again on Wednesday. The last comment James makes about the poor versus the rich, that's kind of the dichotomy that he paints. James is not instructing them to hate the rich necessarily, even though he says, look, your unequal treatment of the rich, your favoritism for the rich is not in your favor. They're not helping you. So why do you keep trying to buddy up with them? He ends in verse 8 with, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and calls this the royal law. We talked about the royal law a little bit before in other classes. We might talk about it a little more going forward. But this should dispel any idea that James is saying, you've picked the wrong side, you need to be prejudiced the other way. That's not James's point. His point is, break those categories and those unfair weighting systems that you use and treat everyone as an individual. Jesse?
Just real quick, another type of prejudice is location prejudice. We moved here, let me rephrase this, we moved back here to California. And some of the areas that we went to, it was, where'd you guys come from? Oh, we just moved back here from California. They didn't hear the back. They just, they're Californians and they start treating us totally different. And
Did they try to
started ostracizing.
sprinkle holy water on you when you got back?
Right, because that's exactly how it felt.
Yeah, location and just association. We could talk endlessly about these categories, and it really is worth the time to do some learning about the subject and some thinking about yourself as it relates to the subject. But appreciate all the comments this morning. Thank you, everyone.